Welcome to the program. I'm Jeff Schechtman. 44 men have been president of the United States. Each came to office with unique ambitions, desires, and skills, or lack thereof. Few sought the office as passionately and as desperately, and came as far to achieve it, as Richard Nixon. The real tragedy, I suppose, is that in that passion, that desire, that ambition, coupled with his setbacks along the way, were sown the seeds of his own destruction. Perhaps if Nixon had been elected in 1960, both Vietnam and Richard Nixon might have evolved differently, and the world today might be a different place. Such is the power of the character of the people we place in office. As the late journalist Richard Ben Kramer explained, what it takes to win sometimes gives us presidents that we might not really want to govern us. This is so much the story of Richard Nixon. So much has been written about Nixon. Much of it has come in waves. There was the period after his resignation of the bad Nixon. Then after his death, the better Nixon. Now writers, journalists, and historians are trying to pull all the threads together. Perhaps Bill Clinton put it best in his eulogy for Nixon when he said that the day of judging President Nixon on anything less than his entire life and career must come to a close. We're going to talk about that entire life today in the context of a new biography of Nixon by my guest, John Farrell. John Farrell is the author of award-winning biographies of Clarence Darrow and Tip O'Neill. He's a longtime journalist who's worked for the Denver Post and the Boston Globe, and it is my pleasure to welcome John Farrell here to talk about Richard Nixon, the life. John, thanks so much for joining us.
Oh, this is my pleasure. Thank you.
It's great to have you here. One of the most, remarkable things about Nixon, when you look at the totality of that life, is how far he came with the limitations as a politician that he had. Talk about that first.
Sure. He had an almost Dickensian childhood. He grew up in the outback of Southern California in the days before cul-de-sacs and freeways. In a little town called Yorba Linda that looked very much almost like the Oklahoma of the Dust Bowl days. His father was a brutish man. His mother was somewhat cold. She used to retreat into her closet to pray, and Nixon very famously said that in all his life, she never said that she loved him. He had two brothers who died, the best and the brightest older brother, and then the youngest baby brother. And so it was really an awful childhood that he had, and he learned to be self-sufficient. He learned to hide his feelings and to cloak himself from the pains of human emotion. But he had this drive, and he had a little spark of idealism from the Quaker side of his mother's family that led him into politics when he got home after World War II.
Talk a little bit about that idealism, because it's clearly there, and you talk a lot about it in your book, and yet it's hard to separate the idealism on the one hand from the resentment that is so much a part of Nixon's personality on the other.
Yeah, it was the great tussle of his life. As many of the guys who came home from World War II, Nixon was resolved to try to make a better world so that all that suffering and bloodshed would not go to waste. And so you had people like Nixon and Jack Kennedy leaping into politics as the voices of that new generation of second lieutenants and captains and ensigns who fought the war. Nixon carried that, like I said, mixed with this sort of idealism from his mom's side of the family into politics. When he was wooing his wife, Pat, she very quickly identified this in him, and I think it was for either their first anniversary or his birthday, she gave him a figurine of a mounted knight in armor. So she saw in him from the very beginning a dragon slayer or a giant killer and a force for good in the world, and that's how he carried forth his initial political campaigmes. But the flip side of that was that he always had this sense of intrigue. He always had this feelings of insecurity, insufficiency. He was Iago to his own Othello, who was always whispering in his own ear that it wasn't good enough, that the Kennedys were more dashing and richer and more handsome, and or that the liberal establishment of the New Deal would never love somebody or accept somebody like Richard Nixon. There's a really sad tape, one of the White House tapes that has come out in just the last couple of years of Nixon and his aide, Henry Kissinger, talking when they get back from the famous trip to China, which was his greatest triumph, his greatest accomplishment. And yet here they are talking in the Oval Office, and Nixon badmouths the trip. He says, "Oh, the American people, they're a bunch of suckers. They see me shaking hands with Mao and think the world has changed. But you and Henry, you and I know it hasn't." So just a very sad story to tell. And the original title of the book was Richard Nixon and American Tragedy.
It's interesting, too, how he always wore this sense of resentment on his sleeve, and he set himself up, others to take advantage of it. The press took advantage of it. Even Eisenhower took advantage of it.
Yeah, he was an easy dog to kick. But the genius of Richard Nixon was that he could identify these feelings, these grievances and resentments in the voters. And he found ways to tap that sense of resentment very shrewdly, and in many ways began, or was one of the politicians who began, the great polarization of the second half of the 20th century that has so polarized our politics today. So in Nixon's insecurities that he brings into politics as divisive and polarizing, we have the culture war of the 60s that leads to today's very divisive politics. And so he's still among us, even though he's been gone for since the 1990s.
Right, and I would argue, I mean, there's a lot of wonderful things in your book, but one of the most remarkable aspects is really seeing how clearly Nixon is responsible, is at the fulcrum of this kind of resentment politics in America that has existed since that time and only gotten stronger.
Yeah, he got into trouble when he was first selected by Dwight Eisenhower to be his running mate in 1952. He was accused of having a slush fund of monies donated by wealthy Southern Californians to keep him in a style beyond his salary. And so he went on national television and he did this famous speech called the Checker speech, and you can see it on YouTube if you're interested. It's one of the most skillful uses of television as a political tool ever. And since television now has to struggle with the internet, probably it will be forever.
Right.
And in it, Nixon talks about his wife's cloth coat and the fact that his little girls have this little puppy dog named Checkers, and no matter what the evil critics demand, they're not going to give this little dog up. And this really struck a chord in millions of Americans who felt that, mainly in the heartland, looking out towards the elites of the coasts, and thinking that they were being left behind, that their voice was not being listened to, that the values of the big cities and the newspaper city rooms and the academic lounges at the great universities were taking over the country and ruining what they were, spoiling what they were learning in church on Sunday or from their parents. And Nixon was this voice. He was this symbol of what he came to call this silent majority.
Part of the reason I would argue that it worked, and you talk a bit about this, is that Nixon came to that populism that kind of is at the root of this, that he came to it kind of honestly. It wasn't an add-on. It was something that he kind of grew up with. Yeah,
he definitely had a tough life. Like I said, his older brother got tuberculosis, and that divided the family. Nixon's mom had to take the older brother to Arizona, where the air was thinner and drier, and the family finances were ruined. And so Nixon was told that he would be accepted at Ivy League colleges like Yale and Harvard, and couldn't go because the family couldn't even afford just to buy him a train ticket cross country. He had to stay home and work in the family store. He got up at 3:00 in the morning to drive into Los Angeles to do the shopping at the markets, the big farmers markets, and then drove the vegetables home and had to put them out before he went to school, where he managed a full day, and including extracurricular activities. He was his school class president. And then he'd come back and work in the store some more, and all the oral histories of the kids, cousins, neighbors of Whittier and Yorba Linda talk about what the smart kid reading books, and the kids from Whittier saying that they would drive past the crossroads at midnight, going home at the end of their dates, and there would be Dick in the kitchen at the table, still studying, knowing that he had to get up in 3 hours and start the cycle all over again. So yeah, he definitely came to it the hard way. Always by himself, never had no political machine, had no big wealthy sponsors. Just Dick and his yellow pad and that great brain.
There's also this remarkable irony as you look at it from this perspective, that in his first run for the presidency, that he would be running against somebody like Jack Kennedy, who represented the antithesis of all this, who represented in the best and the brightest everything that Nixon resented.
Yeah, great observation. And they were friends. That's the amazing thing. They met in 1946. They had a somewhat similar World War II experience. They fought in the same theater, the South Pacific, the Solomon Islands campaign, and they hit it off. And throughout the 1950s, you see comments from JFK defending Richard Nixon to his Harvard friends. And you hear comments about Richard Nixon moved to tears when JFK had near fatal surgery, saying, "Dear Jack, that brave boy is going to die." So they had this very close friendship. Jack and Jackie invited Dick and Pat to their wedding. And in 1960, they ended up squared off against each other. And on the final night, on election night, there's all these allegations that Texas and Illinois had been stolen by the Democrats. And this betrayal was twice as painful to Nixon, because it was his friend Jack Kennedy who was doing this to him. And so he resolved after that he would never be outspent or outcheated again. And there's a marvelous story of a Secret Service agent walking down the aisle of the plane in 1968, and walking up to Nixon not seeing him, and Nixon is sitting there pounding the armrest of his seat in the airplane, saying, "Got to be tougher, got to be tougher, got to be tougher," because he just had resolved that what the Democrats did to him in 1960 was not going to happen again, and this led him, of course, to overreact and led us down the trail towards Watergate.
There's also the sense that, and the unique aspect that he didn't protest the results of the election, that he accepted them.
I think that he definitely would have protested it. There were protests on the local level by the Republican Party, but they just didn't have the evidence. One of the problems with Eisenhower as a party leader is that he had let the Republican Party decay, even though he was immensely personally popular. And so in many of these key cities, the Republicans didn't even have poll watchers or the actual people on the ground who could have sworn out affidavits that they saw cheating going on, or checked to make sure that the Democratic machines were not finagling with the election results.
Talk a little bit about what happened after the 1960 loss. And I mean, and you just touched on it in terms of got to be tougher, got to be stronger. Yeah, and how it built up that scar tissue, it built up that resentment in him to what would be considered almost toxic levels.
He came away from 1960, like I said, resolved that he would never be outcheated again, and then lost the 1962 race for California governor, and had this famous a press conference where he announced that the press would never have Nixon to kick around anymore. And supposedly left politics. He moved from California to New York. He had this job as a corporate lawyer, and he called this his wilderness years. And during this time, he had a client, Pepsi-Cola, who sent him around the world. And it was useful for Nixon because he would go into a country. He would stop at the U.S. Embassy. He would make friends with the ambassador and his staff, the career staff of the State Department, learn about that country, and then he would go over and talk to the mid-level government officials, sometimes even the top-level government officials. And he was filling his mental Rolodex, as it were, about the status of the world. And in 1965, he writes this amazing article in Foreign Affairs magazine called Asia after Vietnam, in which he predicts the computer revolution and the coming of the information age, and how dictators will no longer be able to force their peoples onto massive government farms or into factories through assembly lines, because intellectual freedom and creativity are going to be the new values of this coming age. It's quite a remarkable document, and in it he talks about how China is going to have to be integrated into the world society as well. So throughout this time, these wilderness years, he's thinking, and the gears are going. And then in 1968, a series of amazing events. Eugene McCarthy almost beating Lyndon Johnson in New Hampshire, the Tet Offensive, Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy both being assassinated, George Wallace running for president, all 50 years ago next year. Very tumultuous year. The riots at the Democratic Convention in Chicago make Nixon look like, rather than old goods, he looks like a mature, mellow statesman who can perhaps lead us out of this. And he tells the country that he has a plan to end the war in Vietnam honorably, and he gets elected by a whisker in November 1968.
Talk a little bit about the decision that he made to move to New York, because in many ways it was one of the more profound decisions that really led him to the point we're talking about.
Yeah, he always joked about it. He would say, if I keep doing this, meaning living in California, I'm going to be I'll be dead in 2 years. It's just not thrilling enough for me. Whereas New York is where the action is, and so he left California. Of course, he returned to it and established the Western White House at San Clemente. So he didn't leave for good, but he realized that he was going to have to infiltrate this Eastern establishment that he felt had scorned him, and make some inroads with them. So, and he did it very, very, very successfully. He put on what he calls his nice guy act in '68, and he flattered and won a great many members of the press over to the idea that there was this new Nixon, and part of the reason that he got elected in '68.
One of the particularly interesting things about Nixon is that he had this, on the one hand, amazing self-awareness and really a great kind of understanding of where he was at any particular time, but he was so dismissive of any kind of self-analysis. I mean, he talks, in the tapes about not putting Nixon on the couch and all of that.
Yeah, and of course he was one of the great self-analyzers of all time. He would always say things like, he would make a statement and then he would immediately couch it with a very revealing phrase that sort of modified what he had originally said. So he would say things like, well, my boyhood was pretty tough, and it was the kind of boyhood where you think about running away. And then immediately he would realize that he was now telling his interviewer that he had a miserable childhood, and then he would immediately say, which is not to say it wasn't like anybody else's. We were very happy on the farm in Yorba Linda. So he constantly blurting out his inner soul, and especially on the tapes, it makes for a historian or a biographer, they're just an unparalleled asset.
Talk a little bit about his meddling with respect to Vietnam and undercutting Johnson.
Yeah, in the summer of 1968, Lyndon Johnson got a feeler from the Soviet Union, and they said that they were willing to apply pressure on North Vietnam to engage in productive, that's the word they used, productive peace talks, in part because they didn't want Nixon to get elected. They wanted to help Lyndon Johnson's vice president, Hubert Humphrey, get elected. So they pressured the North Vietnamese, and the North Vietnamese agreed to participate in productive talks. And Nixon heard about this. Johnson announced a bombing halt and to further this negotiations. Nixon heard about it, and he had one of his campaign officials, a woman named Anna Chennault, approach the South Vietnamese and tell them to drag their feet, go slow, get Nixon elected, and you'll get a far better deal. So Lyndon Johnson heard about this, and he had the South Vietnamese embassy put under surveillance. He had Anna Chenault tailed, and sure enough, they listened in as Anna Chenault made these promises to the South Vietnamese. The South Vietnamese did drag their feet. The peace talks were stalled, and Nixon got elected. So Johnson was furious, and he got Nixon on the phone and accused him of this, and Nixon denied it up and down. And because Johnson didn't have any personal proof that Nixon, as the individual, had participated in this skullduggery, he kept it secret. He buried it in the LBJ library, and it didn't come out until the 21st century. And Nixon denied it all his life. He denied it on the David Frost show.
Yeah.
And yet, as I was doing the research on the book, I came across a pile of notes by Bob Haldeman, his chief of staff, in which Nixon can clearly be seen saying, "Get Anna Chenault working on the South Vietnamese any way we can monkey wrench it." So I was finally able to put that plot into Nixon's mouth.
It's also fascinating to look at it in the context of events today and talk about back-channel discussions with the Russians and getting a better deal from one candidate than the other.
Oh, definitely, yeah. And Lyndon Johnson faced the same issue that Barack Obama did, which is that you have evidence of interference with a foreign government, but perhaps you don't have proof that the other party's candidate was directly involved. And what do? And there are members of the Democratic Party and the Hillary Clinton campaign who are very bitter about the decision that Obama administration did, which was not to go public and blow the whistle when they had proof that the Russians were interfering in the election last year. But Lyndon Johnson made basically the same decision in 1968. When you're president, you see these things in a different way.
Talk about the degree to which Nixon, and at the point at which Nixon, with this resentment that we were talking about, went over the edge, whether it was the pressures of the presidency or whatever it may have been. It festered even more after he became president, and even after it appeared, as he ultimately did, coasted to an easy re-election victory.
Yeah, he right from the very start, within the first 90 days, he hired his first private detective to bug his own staff to stop leaks. So there were like little indications from the very beginning. But it wasn't until he was in office for about 10 months that the anti-war protests of the fall of 1969 really began to ratchet up the pressure and drive down his polling numbers, and he began to fear that he would not win re-election. And he made this conscious decision to send Spiro Agnew out and to make, in his own speeches, to divide the country, to polarize it, and to capitalize on what he called his silent majority and make it an us versus them thing. So you find in the spring of 1970, he decides he's going to expand the war into Cambodia. The campuses go up in flames. There's a shooting incident at Kent State. And under this tremendous pressure, you begin to see Nixon slowly cracking until in the spring of 1971, he's ordering his aides to go out and do massive wiretapping and other dirty tricks of the Democratic candidates.
Was there a single incident, was there a period or even a period of time that we can identify when Nixon just went over the edge in these areas?
Yeah, like I said, I think in the spring and summer of 1971, he doubted he was going to be reelected because the war in Vietnam was dragging on. The two great peace initiatives with the Soviet Union and China had not borne fruit, and there was still massive protests in 1971. And then in the summer of 1971, you have the Pentagon Papers crisis, where Daniel Ellsberg leaks the secret history of the war in Vietnam to the press, and the Nixon administration unwisely tries to halt publication. They get into a huge fight. It goes all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, where the Nixon White House loses. And it's at that point that Nixon is dissatisfied with the performance of the FBI as his state police force, and instead decides he's going to have to bring the skullduggery in-house into the White House, and they begin to hire these guys called the plumbers to be his in-house detectives going out and breaking into Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office, and eventually those are the guys who were caught breaking into the Watergate.
And to Nixon's insight, once again, he had a sense over a year before he resigned, maybe almost a year and a half before, that this was not going to end well.
No, he never really had the confidence that even his great triumphs, as I said, about like opening to China, were going to end well, or that he would get the amount of credit that he deserved, or that they had been due to his brilliance. He attributed a lot of this stuff just to luck, and was afraid that his luck would turn. And in many ways, it did. He was right. He was correct. But it wasn't until the very, very end, till he was saying goodbye to his staff, right before climbing on the helicopter and leaving the White House at the end of Watergate, that he had this realization that he had destroyed himself, and that if you others may hate you, but it's only if they get you to hate them that you destroy yourself. And it was a great final moment of self-recognition. That's also on YouTube. If there's any young folk out there who would like to watch it, it's one of the great moments of American history.
John Farrell, the book is Richard Nixon, The Life. John, I thank you so much for spending time with us.
Oh, I'm delighted every 5 years.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
I'm there.